I knew something was wrong the second I heard the metal post driver echo across my field before sunrise, that hollow thud cutting through the morning fog like it didn't belong there, like someone had already decided my land wasn't mine anymore. I stepped out onto the farmhouse porch barefoot, the wood cool under my feet, the smell of damp soil and diesel hanging heavy in the air, and that's when I saw them. 2 trucks, hazard lights blinking, men in reflective vests driving a steel sign straight into the ground at the edge of my driveway like they'd done it 100 times before, like this was just another property on a list, another job to check off before breakfast, and parked just beyond them, perfectly clean against all that dirt and mist, was a white SUV I recognized immediately. Evelyn Carrington didn't do subtle, not with the way she dressed, not with the way she smiled, and definitely not with the way she took things that didn't belong to her. I could feel the cold air in my lungs as I walked closer, each step crunching gravel that my father had laid down by hand over 30 years ago. Every stone a memory, every inch of that land something he'd built slowly, patiently, without asking anyone's permission. And now there was a bright red notice bolted onto that steel post, bold letters screaming, "Property under review for community redevelopment action." Like my home was some kind of abandoned structure instead of the place where I learned how to fix a broken hinge, where I sat at a wooden table listening to my dad talk about land like it was something alive. One of the workers glanced at me, hesitated for half a second, then went right back to tightening the bolts like I wasn't even standing there, like I didn't matter in whatever decision had already been made about my life. And that's when Evelyn stepped out of her SUV, heels sinking just slightly into the soft edge of my field, her perfume hitting the air before her words did, sharp and expensive, completely out of place against the smell of hay and wet earth. She gave me that same polished smile she'd worn the first day she knocked on my door months ago, the one that looked friendly until you realized it never reached her eyes, and she said something about community standards and future development and opportunities for growth. All those clean, harmless words that don't sound like a threat until you realize they're already moving forward without you. And I just stood there, hands at my sides, listening to the steady hum of their equipment and the quiet confidence in her voice. Because the truth is, she thought this was already over. She thought I was just another stubborn homeowner holding on to something outdated, something easy to push aside once the paperwork lined up, and maybe that's what I looked like. Guy in worn boots, standing on a weathered porch, staring at a sign that didn't belong there. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the envelope sitting unopened on my kitchen table, the one stamped in deep blue with a name most people in this town had never even heard, was the same system they were about to use against me. And I had spent the last 10 years quietly building a position inside it that made their entire plan a lot more fragile than they realized. So I let them finish driving that post into my land. I let them bolt that notice down tight. And I let Evelyn believe, just for a little longer, that she was the one in control. I did not pull that notice down right away. I just stood there for a long second after they left, listening to the quiet settle back over the field like nothing had happened, like the land itself was trying to pretend it had not just been marked. And then I turned and walked back up the porch steps, each board creaking the same way it always had, the same rhythm I had known since I was a kid, running in from the yard with dirt on my hands, and my father telling me to wipe my boots before stepping inside. The screen door clicked shut behind me, and the house wrapped around me in that familiar mix of old wood, coffee grounds, and a faint trace of motor oil that never really leaves a place built by someone who fixed everything himself. And right there on the kitchen table sat that envelope, thick paper, deep blue seal, the kind of thing most people would open the second it arrived, but I had left it there for 2 days, not because I did not know what was inside, but because I knew exactly what it represented. My father used to say land does not care how much money you have. It only respects who shows up for it every day. And for most of my life, I believed that meant staying, working, fixing fences, keeping things simple. But after he passed, after the last time I heard his boots on this floor, I learned something else, something he never had to deal with. That land might not care about money, but the people circling it always do. And they do not come at you with tractors or tools anymore. They come with paper, with signatures, with systems built so quietly you do not even realize you are inside them until they start closing in. I picked up the envelope and ran my thumb along the edge, feeling the slight ridge where it had been sealed, And for a moment I could hear Evelyn's voice from earlier, smooth and certain, talking about development like she was doing me a favor, like this place was just waiting for someone like her to decide what it should become. And I almost smiled, not because any of this was funny, but because I had seen this pattern before, not here, not on this land, but in conference rooms 3 states away, where people in suits talked about properties the same way she just had, reducing them to numbers, projections, opportunities, and I had sat at those tables, listened, learned, and eventually bought my way into the part of the system they all depended on. I set the envelope back down and walked to the window, looking out at that new sign standing in my field, bright and out of place against the soft green of early summer, and I could still see the tire tracks from their trucks cutting across the grass like they had already mapped out where everything would go, roads, driveways, rows of houses that all looked the same. And for the first time since this started, I let myself feel what they expected me to feel, that tight pressure in my chest, the kind that tells you something is slipping out of your hands, something you cannot replace. But it did not last long, because beneath that was something steadier, something built over years of watching how people like Evelyn operated, how they pushed just far enough to see if you would break, how they assumed silence meant weakness. And I had learned a long time ago that the best place to be when someone thinks they have already won is exactly where I was standing now, quiet, overlooked, holding information they had not even considered checking. So I poured myself a cup of coffee, the same chipped mug my father used every morning, and I sat down at that table with the envelope in front of me, the sign still visible through the window, and I let the moment settle, because I knew this was not just about a house or a piece of land anymore. This was about understanding exactly how far they were willing to go, and making sure when I finally moved, it would be in a way they could not undo. I met Evelyn Carrington the first week she decided my land was part of her future, and she introduced herself the way people like her always do, with a smile that felt practiced and a tone that sounded helpful until you listened closely enough to hear the assumption underneath it, like she had already placed me somewhere on a chart in her head, and I just had not caught up yet. It was a late afternoon, sun low over the fence line, and she walked up my driveway without calling first, heels clicking against gravel like it was pavement, not once looking down at where she stepped, like the ground would adjust itself for her. And when she reached the porch, she paused just long enough to take in the house, the peeling paint, the old swing my father built, the wind chimes that had been there longer than she had probably lived in this state. And I saw it in her eyes, that quick calculation, not of what the place meant, but of what it could be worth if it were something else. She told me about the community she represented, about standards and improvements and how the area was evolving. Words that sounded neutral but carried a direction. And when I did not immediately agree, when I just leaned against the door frame and listened, she shifted slightly, her smile tightening just enough to show me this was not really a conversation. It was an opening move. Over the next few weeks, she became a regular presence, sometimes in person, sometimes through letters slipped into my mailbox, always polite, always official, each one carrying a little more weight than the last, like she was building a case piece by piece. And it did not take long for me to understand that Evelyn was not working alone. She had a system behind her. People who handled paperwork, people who handled legal language, people who could make something look like a community decision when it was really just a coordinated push. Then there was Cole Danner, her second in command, though he never introduced himself that way. He was the one who talked numbers, who referenced comparable sales, who stood at the edge of my property one morning with a tablet in his hand, pointing out where a new access road could run, where additional homes could be placed, speaking about my land like it was already divided into lots waiting for buyers. And he never once asked if I was interested, because in his mind that part had already been decided. What made it worse was how reasonable they sounded to everyone else, how clean their language was, how easily they turned something personal into something procedural, and I could feel it starting to shift around me. Neighbors who used to wave now hesitating, conversations getting shorter, like Evelyn's version of the story had started to take hold before I even realized there was a story being told. One evening I drove into town for supplies and saw a printed board set up in the window of a real estate office, glossy renderings of what this area could become, neat rows of houses, landscape paths, a name already chosen for a development that did not exist yet. And right there, in the corner of that layout, was my farmhouse, not as a home, but as an obstacle, a small shape outlined in red like it was something to be removed. That was the moment it became clear this was never about compliance or standards. It was about control, about turning something lived in into something marketable. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized Evelyn was not improvising. She was following a plan, one that depended on people like me either giving in quietly or being pushed just far enough to justify taking the next step and standing therein. That office, looking at my own land reduced to a problem on a printed board, I understood exactly what kind of opponent I was dealing with. Not loud, not reckless, but patient, organized, and very sure of herself. The kind of person who only loses when someone understands the system better than she does. The next move did not come all at once. It came in small, controlled steps that felt almost harmless if you looked at them one at a time. Like the morning I found a bright yellow notice taped neatly to my mailbox stating that my exterior paint did not meet updated community guidelines, even though that same paint had been there for over a decade without a single complaint. Or the afternoon a man with a clipboard stood at the edge of my yard measuring the height of my grass like it was a safety concern instead of a field that had been cut the same way since my father taught me how to handle a mower. Each interaction was polite, documented, and completely intentional. And that was what made it effective, because nothing they did looked like an attack on its own. It looked like procedure, like maintenance, like progress, and the more they repeated it, the more it started to feel like the ground under me was shifting without ever actually moving. Letters began arriving twice a week, then 3 times, each one thicker than the last, referencing sections and subsections of regulations that had never mattered before. Language so specific it felt designed to exhaust anyone who tried to push back. And I responded to every single one. Typed, dated, documented. Not because I thought it would stop them, but because I knew they were building a record, and I was not about to let that record go one-sided. Still, it escalated. A notice about structural inspection followed by a recommendation for voluntary compliance adjustments, which is a phrase that sounds optional until you read the fine print and realize it is anything but. And then came the survey stakes, thin wooden markers driven into the soil along the edge of my property, each one placed just far enough in to make you question your own boundaries, like they were testing how much I knew about what was mine. I remember standing there one evening, the sun dropping low, casting long shadows across those stakes, and hearing a car slow down on the road. A neighbor I had known for years glancing over, and then looking away a second too quickly. And that was when it hit me that this was no longer just paperwork. This was perception. They were changing how people saw this place, how they saw me, turning something steady into something uncertain. A week later, I received the first letter that mentioned risk assessment tied to financing. And that was the moment everything snapped into focus, because that was not a coincidence. That was a strategy. A way to move the fight from the land itself into the system that controls who gets to keep it. And I could almost picture Evelyn sitting somewhere clean and quiet, reviewing documents, making notes, deciding how far to push next, confident that every step was backed by rules no one else had the time or patience to fully understand. I leaned against the fence that night, running my hand along the rough wood my father had set decades ago, feeling every groove and splinter like it was part of a map I knew better than anyone. And I realized this was no longer a disagreement or even a dispute. It was a coordinated attempt to turn something deeply personal into something they could legally absorb. And the worst part was how calm it all looked from the outside. No shouting, no obvious conflict, just a steady tightening of control, like a process already in motion long before I noticed it, and standing there in the fading light, with those stakes cutting lines through my field and those letters stacked on my kitchen table, I understood one thing clearly. This was not a small problem anymore. And whatever came next was going to decide whether this place stayed what it had always been or became just another lot on someone else's plan. I did what anyone would do at first. I tried to meet them where they claimed the rules lived. I gathered every document I had, the original deed, the county records, the tax receipts that went back years, all stacked neatly in a folder that still smelled faintly like old paper and dust. And I walked into one of their HOA meetings thinking that if I just laid everything out clearly, if I spoke calmly and stuck to facts, it would be enough to stop whatever this was turning into. The room was exactly what you would expect: folding chairs, a long table at the front, a projector casting clean, polished slides about community improvements onto a white wall, and people sitting quietly with that same look I had started noticing more and more. The look of someone who does not want to be involved, but does not want to be the next target either. And when Evelyn saw me walk in, she did not look surprised. She looked prepared. Like this moment had already been accounted for. I waited my turn, listened as they discussed landscaping budgets and parking guidelines like none of this was connected. And then when my name came up, I stepped forward, placed my folder on the table, and started explaining, not arguing, just explaining where my property lines were, how long the farmhouse had been there, how every so-called violation had either been misapplied or exaggerated. And for a brief second, it felt like the room shifted, like a few people actually heard me. But then Evelyn leaned forward, hands folded neatly, and redirected the entire conversation with a tone so controlled it almost sounded reassuring. She thanked me for my input, acknowledged my documents, and then moved the focus back to what she called broader community impact, framing my situation as one piece of a larger plan, something that needed to be evaluated in context, not in isolation. And just like that, everything I had brought into that room was no longer the point. Cole followed up with numbers, projections, carefully selected examples of how redevelopment had increased property values in similar areas. And suddenly the conversation was no longer about whether my rights were being pushed. It was about whether keeping things the way they were made sense for everyone else. And I could feel it slipping, not because I was wrong, but because I was outnumbered in a system designed to make the majority feel like progress was always the right answer. They voted on a preliminary action, not a final decision, just enough to keep the process moving. And it passed with a show of hands that felt almost automatic, like people were following a current they did not fully understand. And when the meeting ended, a few neighbors avoided eye contact. One gave me a small nod that said more than words ever could, but none of it changed the outcome. I walked back to my truck under the harsh parking lot lights, the air cooler now, the smell of asphalt replacing the earth I was used to. And for the first time since this started, I felt that edge of frustration sharpen into something heavier, not panic, not fear, but the realization that playing this straight, playing it fair inside their structure, was not going to stop what they had already set in motion, because this was never just about rules. It was about control over how those rules were applied. And as I drove back toward the farmhouse, headlights cutting through the dark, I kept thinking about how easily they had shifted the conversation away from facts and into something harder to fight, something that made resistance look unreasonable. And by the time I pulled into my driveway and saw that red notice still standing there in my field, I understood something I had been holding off on admitting. My first move had failed, and whatever came next was going to have to be played on a level they were not expecting. They did not wait long after that meeting to push harder, and the next step came in the form of something that looked routine on the surface but carried a different weight the moment I read it. A certified letter stamped with language that tied my property to a formal risk evaluation connected to financing, not just local compliance, not just community standards, but the kind of wording that reaches beyond fences and into systems most people never think about until it is too late. And as I stood there at the kitchen counter, that same envelope from before sitting just inches away, I could feel the shift in what they were doing. This was no longer about making my place look out of line. This was about creating pressure where it matters most, the part of ownership that runs through paperwork and institutions, not soil and wood. A few days later, a man in a pressed shirt and a badge from a third-party inspection service showed up at my gate, polite, professional, carrying a tablet loaded with forms that had already been partially filled out before he even stepped onto the property, and he explained that he was there to assess structural integrity and environmental compliance, terms that sounded neutral but were clearly part of something larger. And I let him walk through, not because I trusted the process, but because I needed to see how far this had already gone. And as he moved from room to room, taking notes, measuring, documenting things that had never been a problem before, I noticed how every detail was framed in a way that could be interpreted later. Small imperfections turned into potential liabilities, normal wear translated into future risk. By the time he left, the air inside the house felt different, not because anything had actually changed, but because I could see how easily someone could take what he recorded and turn it into a narrative that justified action. And that same evening, another letter arrived, referencing preliminary findings and suggesting that continued evaluation could impact long-term property viability within the broader development plan, language that was careful, calculated, and very deliberate. I walked out to the porch again, the sky dimming into that deep blue that comes just before full dark, and I looked out at the field where those stakes still stood, now joined by faint lines of spray paint marking where future paths might run, and for the first time since this started, I could see the full shape of what they were building, not just on my land, but around it, a system designed to make staying feel harder than leaving, to turn patience into pressure, to make the idea of holding on seem unreasonable. I leaned against the railing, listening to the distant hum of a car passing on the road, and I thought about how precise all of this was, how nothing was accidental. Every letter, every visit, every quiet shift in perception adding up to something that looked inevitable if you did not know how it worked. And that was when the frustration I had been holding finally settled into something clearer, something sharper, because I recognized the pattern. I had seen it from the other side. I knew exactly what stage this was, the point where they assumed the person on the receiving end does not understand the system well enough to respond in kind. And that assumption, more than anything else, was where they had made their mistake. Because standing there in the fading light, with their notices stacking up and their plan unfolding exactly as intended, I was no longer thinking about how to defend what was mine. I was thinking about how to step into the part of the system they believed I did not belong in and turn it in a direction they would not see coming. The thing about systems like this is that they leave fingerprints if you know where to look, not obvious ones, not mistakes you can point to right away, but small inconsistencies that only stand out if you have spent enough time on the inside to recognize what should not be there. And it started with one line buried halfway down the last letter they sent, a reference number tied to a servicing entity that did not match any local institution, not the bank in town, not the regional lender most people used, but something else, something layered. And I sat at the kitchen table with that letter spread out in front of me, the lamp casting a soft yellow circle over the paper while the rest of the room faded into shadow, and I read that line again, slower this time, letting the name settle, because it felt familiar in a way that did not make sense at first. I reached for the envelope that had been sitting there since the morning all this started, the one I had not opened until now, and when I finally slid a finger under the seal and pulled the contents free, the paper inside was crisp, formal, the kind of report most people would not understand without context, but I did, because I had spent years learning exactly how these structures were built, and right there in the header was the same network name, not identical, but close enough that I could see the connection, like two roads that eventually lead to the same place. I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under me, and let the pieces start to line up, the inspection, the letters, the language about risk and financing. It was all tied to a servicing chain, a pathway that determined how pressure could be applied without ever stepping outside the boundaries of legality. And the more I followed it, pulling up records, cross-checking names, the clearer it became that Evelyn and her people were not just acting on their own authority. They were relying on a structure that extended far beyond the HOA, one that fed into a larger financial system designed to manage properties, not protect them. What they did not realize was that I knew that system from the inside, not as someone caught in it, but as someone who had invested in it, studied it, and eventually positioned myself in a place where I could see the entire network from above. And as I traced the connections further, moving from one entity to the next, I found the link that changed everything, a parent company that sat quietly at the top of the chain, one that most people would never notice because it did not interact directly with homeowners. It did not send letters or conduct inspections. It simply held the structure together. And that company, through a series of acquisitions and partnerships that had taken years to build, was one I controlled. I sat there for a long moment after that realization. The only sound in the house, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant rustle of wind moving through the trees outside. And I could feel the entire situation shift in my mind, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in that quiet, steady way that comes when you finally understand exactly where you stand. Because up until that point, I had been reacting, responding to what they put in front of me, trying to hold my ground within their framework. But now I could see the framework itself. I could see how they planned to use it. And more importantly, I could see where it depended on something they did not control. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back on the table next to the report, and looked out through the window at the field where their sign still stood. And for the first time since they drove that post into my land, I felt something settle into place. Not relief, not satisfaction, but clarity. Because the moment you understand the system is the moment it stops being something you are trapped in and starts becoming something you can navigate. And standing there in that quiet house, surrounded by everything they were trying to turn into a line item, I realized they had not just pushed too far, they had pushed in the one direction that gave me exactly what I needed, a way in. Once you see the structure clearly, you stop reacting to what is in front of you and start asking who benefits from each step. And that was where everything began to open up, because every letter they sent, every inspection they triggered, every line of language about risk and compliance pointed back to a chain of entities that were supposed to operate independently, but in reality moved in sync. And I spent the next 2 days going through it piece by piece, not rushing, not guessing, just pulling records, cross-referencing filings, and building a map that most people would never have the patience to assemble. The morning light would come through the kitchen window, hitting the table where I had spread everything out, stacks of documents, notes in the margins, names connected by arrows that started to form a pattern, and what looked at first like a local dispute slowly revealed itself as something far more deliberate. A coordinated use of financing pressure to create leverage over properties that stood in the way of development. I found the servicing agreements that allowed third-party inspectors to flag properties in ways that could influence lending risk. I traced the ownership of the development company Cole was tied to, and every path I followed kept circling back to the same network, the same quiet layer of control that did not need to be visible because it did not operate at the surface level. It operated underneath, where decisions were made based on data, not conversations. What stood out was not just that they were using this system. It was how casually they were relying on it, like they believed no one would ever question the source of that authority. And that assumption gave me something more valuable than any single document. It gave me their blind spot. I called up a set of internal reports through a secure channel that had not been active in months. The kind of access you only keep if you expect to need it again, and when the files loaded, the numbers confirmed what I had already started to suspect. Multiple properties tied to members of the HOA board, including Evelyn and Cole, were financed through the same mortgage network, the same structure that ultimately reported upward to the parent entity I controlled. And the moment that connection locked into place, the entire situation shifted from a defensive position into something else entirely. I was no longer looking at how they could take my land. I was looking at how exposed they were while trying to do it, how the very system they trusted to protect their position depended on rules and compliance standards they were now bending to pressure me. And that kind of contradiction does not stay hidden if someone knows where to apply attention. I stepped outside that afternoon, the air warmer now, the smell of cut grass drifting from a neighboring property, and I walked out to where their sign stood, the metal post firm in the ground like they had already claimed the space, and I looked past it toward the line of houses in the distance, the ones that had been built over the last few years, clean and uniform, all part of the same expansion plan. And I knew that many of those homes, maybe most of them, were tied into the same financial structure, the same network they were now using as leverage against me. And for the first time since this started, I could see the full scale of what they were risking without even realizing it. I rested my hand against that metal post for a second, feeling the cool surface under my palm, and I thought about how easily they had assumed this was a simple equation, pressure plus time equals compliance. But they had overlooked something fundamental. Systems like the one they were using are not one-way tools. They are interconnected, and when you pull on one part of it, you do not just move that piece. You affect everything attached to it. And standing there in my own field, with their plan laid out in front of me clearer than it had ever been, I understood that the next step was not about stopping them directly. It was about choosing the exact point in that system where a single, precise move would force everything else to respond. The moment I realized I was not the only one who had noticed something off was the morning Martha Bell stopped by with a pie she did not need an excuse to bring, the screen door creaking open behind her as she stepped into the kitchen like she had done 100 times before. But this time, there was something different in the way she set the dish down, slower, more deliberate, like she had come to say something she had been holding back. She glanced out the window at the sign in my field, then back at me, and in that quiet, careful voice of hers, she mentioned how she had seen Evelyn talking weeks ago, not at a meeting, not in public, but out near the road with Cole and another man in a suit, pointing toward my land and laughing about how long it would take to clear that last piece. And the way she said it told me she had not forgotten it, had not liked it, and had not known what to do with it until now. I did not interrupt. I just listened, letting her describe the day, the time, the exact way Evelyn had stood with one hand on her hip, like she already owned everything she was looking at. And when Martha finished, she folded her hands together and gave me a look that carried more weight than anything written in those letters, because it confirmed what I had already started to piece together. This was never about standards, it was about intent. Later that afternoon, I made a call to Daniel Price, someone I had worked with years ago on a matter that required precision more than noise. And when he answered, I could hear the pause in his voice when I explained what was happening. Not surprise, but recognition, the kind that comes from seeing patterns repeat under different names, and he agreed to take a look, not as a formal case yet, just as a set of questions that needed to be answered before anything escalated further. We went through the documents together, line by line, his voice steady as he pointed out inconsistencies, the way certain reports were worded to suggest risk without proving it, the way the HOA actions aligned just enough with external financial triggers to raise concern without crossing into anything obviously illegal on the surface. And that was the key. It all sat right at the edge, structured to hold up if no one looked too closely. Over the next couple of days, Lila helped me organize everything into something more than scattered notes, timestamps matched with letters, names connected to entities, each piece placed where it belonged until the picture became clear enough to explain to someone who had not lived through it. And the more we built it out, the more it stopped feeling like I was standing alone against a system and started to feel like I was standing at the center of something that had been carefully constructed and could just as carefully be taken apart. What mattered now was not just what I knew, but how and when to use it, because acting too soon would only give them time to adjust, to close gaps, to shift their position before it could be challenged properly, and acting too late would let them push further into territory that would be harder to unwind. So I stood out on the porch that evening, the sky turning that same deep blue as before, the wind moving softly through the trees, and I looked out at the land that had carried my family through generations, knowing that for the first time since this began, I was not reacting to their moves anymore. I was preparing my own, and the difference between those two things was everything. I did not rush into the next move, because the difference between reacting and controlling a situation comes down to timing, and I knew if I showed my hand too early, Evelyn would do what people like her always do, adjust, redirect, find another angle that kept her in control. So instead, I let everything continue exactly as she expected. I let the letters keep coming. I let the inspections sit on record. I even responded to a few minor notices, just enough to maintain the appearance that I was still playing inside the lines she had drawn. Meanwhile, behind that quiet surface, everything was shifting. Daniel and I structured the legal side carefully, not as an immediate attack, but as a framework that could be activated the moment their actions crossed from aggressive into actionable, documenting every inconsistency, every instance where procedure was used to create pressure rather than reflect reality, while Lila organized the timeline into something precise enough that no detail could be dismissed as coincidence. And I focused on the part of the system they believed I did not belong to, the financial network that connected their authority to something much larger than an HOA board. I accessed internal compliance channels that rarely see attention unless something goes wrong, reviewing servicing obligations, reporting standards, and the thresholds that trigger audits, not with the intention of disrupting anything unnecessarily, but to understand exactly where their current actions might conflict with the expectations placed on the entities they relied on. And it did not take long to see the gap, the subtle misalignment between how their pressure campaign was being carried out and how the system required it to be justified, a difference small enough to ignore under normal circumstances, but significant enough to matter if someone chose to look directly at it. The plan that formed out of that was simple on the surface but precise underneath. I would not challenge them where they felt strongest. I would let them continue forward until they committed fully to their position, until they tied their actions tightly enough to that financial structure that stepping back would no longer be clean or easy. And only then would I bring everything into the light at once, the documentation, the connections, the questions they had not prepared to answer, all aligned in a way that forced the system itself to respond. I spent that evening walking the edge of my property, the air cool, the sky clear, the faint glow of porch lights from neighboring homes visible in the distance, and I could see the outlines of what they intended to build, not just physically, but procedurally, a path that assumed no one would interrupt it at the right moment. And that was where they had miscalculated, not in their planning, not in their coordination, but in their assumption that the person standing in their way did not understand how their foundation was built. I stopped near the sign they had planted, the metal catching the last of the light, and I looked at it not as a threat anymore, but as a marker, a point in time where their plan became visible enough to engage with properly. And I knew that from this point forward, every step mattered, not in terms of speed, but in precision, because the next move was not about pushing back, it was about letting them believe they were still in control right up until the moment they realized they were not. They chose a Saturday evening to make their move feel official, like a celebration instead of a takeover. String lights stretched across temporary posts at the edge of my field, a portable podium set up just far enough from my porch to suggest courtesy without asking permission, and rows of neatly arranged chairs filling with people who had been invited to witness what Evelyn called the next phase of community growth. And I stood back for a moment before walking over, taking in the scene, the soft glow of lights, the hum of quiet conversations, the polished boards displaying renderings of future homes that did not exist yet. All of it designed to make what they were about to announce feel inevitable, like progress had already been agreed upon. Evelyn stood at the front, composed as ever, her voice carrying easily as she spoke about vision and opportunity, about how the area was evolving and how certain properties, she did not say mine directly at first, needed to be integrated into that vision for the benefit of everyone involved. And as she spoke, Cole stood off to the side with a tablet, ready to present numbers and timelines, reinforcing every word with clean data that made the plan sound reasonable, structured, almost generous. I stepped forward when there was a pause, not interrupting, not raising my voice, just moving into the space like I belonged there, because at that point I did, and I could feel the shift in attention as people noticed me, the quiet ripple through the crowd as conversations stopped and heads turned, and Evelyn's expression held for just a fraction longer than usual before she acknowledged me. That same practice smile returning, as if this was exactly how she expected the evening to go. I set a single folder on the table beside her podium, the same one I had brought to the meeting weeks ago, but this time it was thicker, more complete, and when I opened it, I did not start with arguments or accusations. I started with questions, clear, direct, tied to the documents they had been using, asking how certain assessments had been justified, how certain risk evaluations aligned with actual conditions. And at first she responded the way she always did, redirecting, reframing, keeping everything within the narrative she had built. But then I shifted the focus, just slightly, just enough to move the conversation away from surface-level procedures and into the structure underneath, the servicing entities, the reporting channels, the connections that most people in that crowd had never heard of but were about to understand. I pulled out a second set of papers, not large, not dramatic, just precise, and placed them beside the first, pointing out the overlap, the shared network that tied their actions to a financial system that required consistency, transparency, and proper justification. And for the first time that evening, the room went quiet in a different way, not attentive, but uncertain, because this was not part of the presentation they had come to see. I did not rush it. I let the silence settle, then explained, calmly, that the same network being used to apply pressure on my property also supported a number of properties represented by the very board standing there, and that discrepancies in how that system was being engaged could trigger reviews that extended far beyond a single piece of land. And I watched as the confidence in Evelyn's posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough that someone paying attention could see it, the slight tightening in her shoulders, the brief glance toward Cole that lasted a fraction too long. I closed the folder and rested my hand on it, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, and I told them that I was not there to escalate anything unnecessarily, that I simply wanted to ensure everything being done was aligned with the standards they themselves relied on, and that if those standards were not being met, the appropriate channels would need to be engaged to review it, fully and fairly. And then I stepped back, giving the space back to them. Because the move had already been made, not loudly, not aggressively, but precisely, and as I turned to walk away, I could feel the weight of what had just shifted, not in the crowd, not even in Evelyn directly, but in the structure behind her, the one she had trusted to hold everything in place, now forced to recognize that someone inside that system was finally paying attention. The change did not happen overnight, and it did not need to, because once the right questions are placed in the right system, movement begins whether anyone wants it to or not. And by the following week, the tone of everything around me had shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. The letters stopped arriving as frequently, the language softened, and the same inspection company that had been so thorough before suddenly requested clarification. Instead of issuing conclusions, like someone somewhere had started asking them to justify what they were putting in writing, I received a formal notice midweek, not from the HOA, but from one of the servicing entities tied to the network, requesting additional documentation regarding the assessments that had been submitted in connection with my property. And that was the moment I knew the system had begun to respond, not because of anything loud or dramatic, but because consistency had been challenged and the structure could not ignore it without exposing itself. Daniel called me that afternoon, his voice carrying a different kind of certainty now, explaining that the pattern we had outlined was already drawing attention at a level Evelyn could not control. Not accusations yet, not conclusions, but inquiries, the kind that require answers to be documented, reviewed, and aligned with standards that are not flexible when someone is watching closely. Out in the neighborhood, the shift was just as visible in its own quiet way. The temporary signage near my property line disappeared first, removed without announcement. The survey stakes followed a day later, pulled from the ground like they had never been there. And even the printed renderings in the real estate office window were replaced with something less specific, less committed, like the future they had been selling was suddenly back under consideration. I saw Cole once during that time, standing near his car, outside a listing down the road, and when our eyes met, he did not hold the same confidence he had before. There was a hesitation there now, a calculation, as if he was trying to understand how something that had seemed so controlled had started to move in a direction he had not anticipated. Evelyn, on the other hand, kept her distance. No more visits, no more carefully worded conversations on my porch, just silence where there had once been constant presence, and that silence said more than anything she could have explained, because it meant the ground she had been standing on was no longer as solid as she believed. By the end of the week, another letter arrived, this one from the HOA itself, brief, measured, stating that all actions related to my property were being placed under review pending further clarification, a phrase that would not mean much to most people. But to me, it was exactly what it needed to be, a pause, not a concession, but an acknowledgement that the process could not continue forward without addressing what had been brought to light. I stood on the porch that evening, the same place I had been when this started, looking out over the field that had begun to feel like it was slipping away just days before, and now sat still again, untouched, the grass moving gently in the wind, no markers, no signs, no indication that anything had ever been planned there except for the memory of it. And I realized that this was how control actually works when it is done right, not by force, not by volume, but by understanding where pressure can be applied so precisely that the system corrects itself. And as the sun dropped below the horizon and the last light faded from the edges of the trees, I knew that what had started as a quiet push to take something from me had turned into something else entirely, something they were now trying just as quietly to step away from before it went any further. It did not end with a dramatic announcement or some final confrontation. It ended the way most real things do, quietly, with a series of small corrections that slowly restored what should never have been questioned in the first place. The review process stretched on just long enough to make it clear that no one was going to push it forward again without consequences. And then one morning, I opened my mailbox to find a single letter, plain, official, and direct, stating that all actions related to my property had been formally withdrawn due to insufficient basis under the applicable standards. No apology, no explanation, just a clean step back, the kind that leaves no trace if you were not paying attention. I stood there for a moment with that paper in my hand, the early light catching the edges of it, and I could hear the familiar sounds of the morning around me, wind moving through the trees, a truck passing in the distance, the same world that had been here before any of this started, and I realized how close it had come to changing without ever making a sound. Over the next few days, the rest of it unraveled in its own quiet way. The development plans were scaled back, then delayed, then quietly removed from public view. The people who had once spoken so confidently about expansion and integration suddenly shifting their focus to other projects, other areas, anywhere that did not carry the same risk of scrutiny. And while no one said it out loud, it was clear that whatever had been uncovered had reached far enough into the structure behind it that continuing was no longer worth the exposure. I saw Evelyn once more after that, not on my land, not at a meeting, but across the street from a property showing, standing beside her car, speaking in that same controlled tone she always used. But there was something missing now, not fear, not defeat, just the absence of certainty, like she had finally encountered a limit she could not smooth over with language or process. And when she noticed me, she gave a small nod, not the confident smile from before, just an acknowledgement. And then she turned back to what she was doing. Back at the farmhouse, everything settled into place again. I repaired the loose board on the porch that had been bothering me for weeks, repainted the mailbox the same color it had always been, and left the rest exactly as it was, because it had never needed to change to begin with. And one evening, as the sun dropped low and the field stretched out in front of me untouched and whole, I took that original notice they had planted and set it down on the kitchen table beside the blue envelope, the two pieces of paper that marked the beginning and the turning point of everything that had happened, one representing what they thought they could take, the other representing what they never realized they were up against. And I left them there, not as a reminder of conflict, but as proof of something simpler, that power does not always look like control from the outside. Sometimes it looks like patience, like understanding, like knowing exactly when to step in and let the system correct itself. And as the light faded and the house settled into that familiar quiet, I knew one thing for certain. They came looking at this place like it was the easiest piece to move. But what they never understood was that the foundation beneath it ran deeper than anything they had built their plans on. And once that foundation pushed back, everything else had no choice but to fall back into place.